Hello. Hi.
Hi, John.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, we can.
Good.
As always, John, loud and clear.
Oh, good, Chris. Good to see you there.
And you?
Yep, good.
No, it's not
Can
good.
you hear me at all?
Yes.
We can.
Sorry, President, I'm not having any beer, unfortunately. I'm only having a little whiskey.
I thought it was a beer evening.
Where are all these pictures? Where are all these people on the screen?
Where are
They're at home. Why not on my screen?
It's probably because my slide is up, Max, and we don't want to take it off in case it doesn't reappear. So I think at the end, when the slides stop, then the format will change. It'll be much easier to see everybody, I think. So
you can see enough, can't you?
Yeah.
There's
I can see 15 at the moment.
Faces. Live faces.
Okay. So it's 5 past now. Shall I begin?
Indeed.
Yes.
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. So it's Steve Ryan here.
Hello.
Unlike Max, a trip to Barbados is not where I'm able to go. Our trip of the year has been to Heswall and back.
Oh, lucky you.
Past Timpenham. We
I
always
wish.
give it a nod when we go past.
Yeah.
Lute, yes.
So, evening, everybody. So I'm Steve Ryan, for those that don't know me, and I'm the current president of the Liverpool Medical Institution, and I'm unusually in my second year for reasons all related to coronavirus. So I'm very pleased to be speaking to you this evening on a subject that's I'm very interested in, and that is beer. So I'll just get my first, this is actually my first slide. So homage to Humulus Lupulus. So Humulus Lupulus is actually the Latin name for the hop plant. And humulus is felt to be a bastardized version of a German word which probably refers to hops. All these things are lost in history. And lupulus is said to refer to baby wolves or wolvelets or whatever you call them, wolf cubs, isn't it? And it is said that this is because the hop plant appears to leap up to strangle the plants that it in the natural world that it climbs up. Seems a bit far-fetched to me, but there you go. That's where the name derives from. And this indeed is a hop plant, or some hop plants. You can see there, and those are the flowers of the hop. And that is actually what the hop flavour that goes into beer actually comes from. And it's the female flowers that, these are female flowers that provide all of the hop flavour. It's the female of the species that actually does all the work, as you'll see later when it comes to the provision of beer.
Will you be sharing the
Say again?
I said
Will you be sharing the difference?
Sharing? Didn't quite.
Showing us the difference between male and female flowers.
No, I've only got this one slide, but
Okay.
unfortunately I won't be able to do so. So they're growing on things called bines, bee bines as opposed to vines. And really, this goes back, this talk developed really for, and members of the 20 Club will know this, because I spoke on the topic of brewing back in the mid-1990s, about 25 years ago. Really, this is by way of an update. So the first thing I'm going to do is just reprise where I got to. That was about 1995. And my talk was on brewing from ancient Babylonian times right up to the invention of the widget. And does everybody know what the widget is? If not,
Definitely.
I shall tell you later. And it is officially called the widget now, which it wasn't originally, because my can of Boddington's actually proudly declaims that it has a widget in it, and take care when approaching a widget.
I thought that's what Colm dealt with.
So we start with Babylonia. As you can see, you can probably mostly read this. The first known beer, called Kui, was said to have been brewed by the ancient Chinese, but I'm not sure there's real tangible evidence of that. However, if you go back to ancient Babylonia and Sumeria, there are definitive records on the clay tablets, of course, which didn't burn down during various libraries burning down over all those millennia, that do depict beer drinking in these times. And in fact, the goddess of beer, Ninkasi, was the patron goddess of brewing at that time, so against the female of the species. And she was the goddess of brewing and baking, baking of bread. And those two things went together, and often done by women rather than men throughout history. Typically, the way they drank the beer was not out of a pint glass, but they would have a crucible with the beer fermenting it, and the beer was made of crunched up bread, which natural yeast from the environment fermented, and they often threw in a bit of honey and indeed grapes, though I don't think you could call it any sort of wine. It wasn't filtered, and consequently you had to drink it with straws. So a number of people would gather around one of these bowls and drink through straws. So it reminded me of when I was a medical student, when we asked for a pint of beer and 4 straws, because we were a bit impoverished at that time. Now the widget, and here you can see 2 cans of, a can of Guinness and a bottle of Guinness. And the plastic things you can see in front of them are the widgets that would have been in those cans. And the widgets actually were patented by Guinness in 1980. And I've actually did go, for my original talk, I went to Manchester Library to get a copy of the original patents. And really the purpose of that was to try and make the beer from cans and bottles actually appear more like the beer you'd get on draft in a pub. The widget, in its original incarnation, held carbon dioxide, which when you released the pressure fizzed out of the widget and caused a fizzy head to appear on the beer. Now originally this was just carbon dioxide, but not long afterwards nitrogen replaced 70% of the CO2, and actually a lot of the beers now have nitrogen and a little bit of CO2, and they give a much creamier head. And the marketing idea behind that, and Boddingtons, if you remember all the big schmoozle with Boddingtons in the 90s, very cream of Manchester. And when it was coming in bottles, that creamy effect was created by the nitrogen. Now, that actually does make the beer smoother, but I think it actually takes away a bit of the bitterness. So if you really like your beers bitter, you probably wouldn't use this in a bitter beer, but it has found its way particularly into stouts and porters, and Guinness, of course, is a stout. So that was the beginning and end of that talk, really. In between, I covered a range of topics. So, alewives of England. Now, originally, beer was predominantly brewed by women at home, and they would often hang a branch of greenery, a few branches of greenery outside the house to show they were brew wives, and they would be often baking the bread as well. And it was only when beer started to be commercialised and you could make money out of it that men became involved and started perhaps to disparage some of the alewives, as you can see in this particular picture, so as to overcome the competition, if you like. So for centuries, men were very happy for women to brew their beer until they could make some money out of it. So, and that's remained very much since then. I think with modern craft brewing, you are seeing a lot more women brewers coming into the profession, but it has been a male-dominated profession. So that's alewives. So that's the Middle Ages coming through to the modern era of industrialisation. And going on to Victorian times, now, if the beer of the 20th century was bitter beer in Britain, in Victorian times, the beer were dark beers and porters, which are a variation on stouts. And this is a story about Muse or Mux's brew house in London. So large were the quantities of porter that were kept in these huge vats to quench the thirst of the Victorian population, who were, for those ones that weren't drinking all the gin, these vats were absolutely enormous. And in this particular case, at this brewery, about 1.5 million litres of porter were released fairly instantly, and actually 8 people drowned as a result of it. This was in 1814, the Great London Beer Flood. So it just shows you the scale of brewing that was going on at that particular time, and the popularity of porter. And obviously, if you look in craft breweries and places selling craft beer, porters are one of the beer styles that's seen a bit of a resurgence. Now, can anybody spot something particularly relating to beer on this Edward Manet painting of 1882? This is the bar at the Folies Bergère.
So there's a Mackinson there.
It's like a Mackinson, it's actually Bass, if you can see.
Okay.
The little red triangle, there's one on the bottom right and one on the bottom left.
Yeah.
And that is Bass beer. And Bass were the first ever trademark of any sort in the United Kingdom ever in 1875 was for Bass beer. Not just the first trademark beer, the first ever trademark. So, and it became internationally famous. The other thing I covered was India Pale Ale, IPA. And you'll notice that one of the beers tonight is called Punk IPA. And IPA means India Pale Ale. Now, a lot of bitter beers now, and particularly stronger beers and craft beers, use this term IPA. That's where it comes from. And these beers were particularly developed in Britain in Victorian times for export to India. And they were a bit stronger, and they had a lot of hops in them. And the idea was the additional alcohol and the hops actually preserve them on these long journeys to India, where they were well sought after. And that's where the term India Pale Ale comes from. So we covered that, and so the derivation of a lot of craft beers is IPA. I covered this thing, which is from Burton, and this is called the Burton Union System. And this was a clever bit of technology in which the beer is fermenting in the 2 barrels you can see beneath the container, the tray above it. And what happens is, as the beer ferments, the yeasty hops, the yeasty froth at the top goes up the curved pipe, down and into this tray where it settles down. And then through another tube you can't see here, the beer is returned back into the barrels. And they would have literally hundreds and thousands of these going at one time. So apparently it was like being in a factory. And this is the system that is still used to make Marston's pedigree, if people are familiar with it. And that's the Burton Union System. And what was the other product that this famously produced? I shall tell you, it was Marmite. Because Marmite, disgusting thing that it is.
Oh, said.
Actually comes from the excess yeast that could be harvested from these trays above. So that's the Burton Union System. That's over in the Midlands, and not to be outdone, in Yorkshire they had a similar system called Yorkshire Stone Squares, and there you can see the top tray with all the yeast on top of it. And that particular system produced a very Yorkshire type of bitters. But worked on a similar principle. Other people got into ales, and what you can see here is a painting. Who do you think that's by?
Picasso.
It is. It's a Picasso, and it's called A Bottle of Bass. Or if you're sophisticated, un bouteille de Bass. Even he had heard of Bass and ale and drank it. So a very famous British beer. So British beers at this time around the turn of the century, really before the advent of lager, were probably some of the most sought after beers anywhere, trademarked and famous around the world. So at that point in the mid 1990s, I covered these things: Babylonia, Alewives, London Porter, the Bass trademark I've talked about, the two systems of yeast harvesting, India Pale Ales, and the widget, which is still with us. The other thing I touched on at that time was the campaign for real ale, which really could be summed up by death to the keg, although the keg now makes a big comeback, and long live cask ales, real ales, live ales, and I'll tell you a little bit about that now. So CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ale, was founded as a consumer organisation in 1971. Published the first Good Beer Guide, which I've had a few copies of, in 1974, still going strong. The first National Beer Festival was in 1975. And they've done some amazing things. At that time, really, the big six brewers were brewing pretty much all the beer we drank in the early 1980s. And actually, a lot of the complexity and diversity in beer drinking we now can get access to is down to the Campaign for Real Ale. However, they do believe fervently in cask conditioned beer. So this is where the beer has not been squirted with carbon dioxide. The yeast, to some extent, is still alive in it. It's not being filtered or centrifuged to get rid of stuff, and it's continuing to ferment in the cask. So it's a real live beer, and they're very much against the modern craft beer movement, which I'll come to in a second, which uses a lot of those things, carbon dioxide, filtration particularly. The other thing that they launched was the Champion Beer of Britain competition. And I think that tells us a lot about how beer has developed over those 25 years since that last lecture I gave. The other thing they do is champion beer styles that are maybe going out of fashion. Mild, pint and mild. You don't see that quite so often nowadays. But they have championed that. And from time to time, it makes a bit of a comeback. So that's the Campaign for Real Ale. That's a keg. So that's probably been pumped with CO2. And actually, for those of us who were drinking beer around that time, might remember things like Double Diamond.
Absolutely.
It wasn't the only offensive beer of that time, but really the beer quality was pretty poor, very bland.
What's the capacity of the keg?
That is equivalent of 1 barrel. So that would be about probably 70, 80 litres, maybe something like that.
So a lot less than a barrique, a wine barrel.
Oh yes, much, much less. These are the ones that in which they're fermented. These are the ones they're transported in.
Right. Okay.
So when that arrived at the pub, the round red thing here, you'd put a connector onto it, which would have CO2 going in and beer coming out.
Okay.
Very sterile, so you can keep that for weeks and weeks and months because it's not live, it doesn't go off. So, landlords would favour that to an extent because you don't waste any beer. The other way, in which the real ale way, CAMRA, is this, which is a cask. And this is one, you see, it's not pressurised. This is set up at a beer festival. And the beer's coming out the left-hand side, out the tap, and the air's getting in at the top. And it's fed by gravity. You can use something, I'll show you later, a beer engine to get the beer out of these from the cellar, if it's down in the cellar. But it's a beer festival. Often the beers would be racked up like this. and that often temperature kegs are often kept cold because those sort of beers are often cold, and the casks would often be a bit warmer. Keep them in the cellar in the pub, but at beer festivals you often see them with Hessian over them and water on them to try and keep them cool. And a typical one would be this, a beer from the northeast called Mordew Worky Ticket, which was the champion beer of Britain. Interestingly, and really probably the first wave of craft ale movement, which was the craft real ale movement, 1997, that one, and that would have been transported around in kegs like that. And they actually went out of business, interestingly, although they've been bought out, and they went into administration. But the brand still lives on in another brewery in that bit of the world. So here were your typical beer drinkers of the campaign for real ale, but they have diversified quite greatly and trying to attract a more diverse clientele. And even the upper echelons of society, of course, enjoy real ale. You have to be careful, though, who's serving it. I think you know. Anybody doesn't know any of those? I think they're all pretty famous, aren't they? So
Yeah.
So there's a beer engine. So you can tell when you go into a pub, of course, because the taps work by electricity. The keg beer comes up by electricity and gets pumped, or CO2 pressure, and gets pumped up. But the beer engine has to be used one of these pumps. So if you go in a pub like the Philharmonic, it'll have a range of taps, which are these for the kegs, and then these for the casks. And you can see the beer engine there used to pull it up. Now, one of the interesting things, I was a student in Yorkshire, the beer engine had a thing called an autovac on it. And what this did was the slops that came out of the little glass of beer here went down into a tray, and that got sucked back into the keg, into the cask. Typical Yorkshire thrift. Probably not the most hygienic way to serve the beer. I actually joined the campaign for real ale briefly, and I went to a meeting or two, and then I was asked to go and help at one of their annual beer festivals, which was here at the Pacific Road Tram Shed in Birkenhead. And I thought I'll be tapping the spiles, shivering the shives, tapping in the keystones. It was going to be very exciting. I was the toilet monitor. And it was a most edifying experience because I saw people arrive completely sober and gradually over the course of a number of hours get absolutely paralytic. And it was quite a thing to see. And I would, anybody who has a complex relationship with alcohol, I would suggest doing this. It's a most salutary lesson. And it was quite cold as well, but amusing in some ways. So champion beer of Britain. So just to show you, these going through from 1978 to 2019 were indeed some champion beers I've selected, and many of you will have drunk some of these from time to time. A lot of them are very famous beers now. And what does tend to happen is that these beers get champion beer, and then they get into the bigger beer merchandising operations, Interbrew and InBev and what have you, who then act to take them over a little bit. Timothy Taylor's from Keighley in Yorkshire. I love that beer. Really tasty. Now, Eindhoven were also responsible for Double Diamond, so it is quite interesting that, you know, a few years later they brewed the champion beer of Britain. Coniston, if you've taken a pint up in the Lake District, there's one. Bluebird Bitter, lovely beer. a porter, so going back to those beers of Victorian era, from Ellen Brewery in Leeds. And then there's one from the south, Sheer Drop in the Surrey Hills, one of the later ones. Now, what's interesting, I started the talk talking about hops, and here we'll come back to that, really. That's just an example of the smooth flow, but I've really covered that. And you can see the head on the beer there that the smooth flow has generated. Now, this is a slide, really, of those beers from 1978 to 2019. And on your left side, you can see the hops that were used in those beers. So we've got Fuggles, which are also called Styrian Goldings. They're the same version. Goldings, Target, Challenger, Northdown, First Gold, Pioneer, and Cascade. And on the right-hand side is the type of hops these are. Classic English hops, some newer English hops from the 1970s. One that's a hedgerow, two that are hedgerow hybrids, where they've crossbred known hops with ones that were just discovered in a hedge, probably between West Kirby and Heswall, I would imagine. And then these new age hops I'm going to come and talk more about from the United States. And what you can see there is over the years, the transition from the classic English hops, which have particular flavours, to these newer hop varieties. And hence there is this change of flavour in hops from the older traditional hops from the 20th century English bitters through to these 21st century beers. So the hop groupings that we generally talk about are what's called noble hops, which are self-declared, and they're the ones typically from Middle Europe, Tettnang, Hallertauer, Saaz and Spalt, and they generally would be in lagers. If you have lager beers, then typically they have quite a different, more mellow hop flavour to them, and those will generally be using these noble hops. The classic English hops I've talked about. So Fuggles is said to taste of mild sadness, old men and grass. And then Goldings, spicy, hoppy and earthy. So a bit more woody flavours, I guess. I was watching Monty Python earlier, if you remember Woody and Tinny, so probably a bit more on the woody side. The newer English hops, and these were actually developed in the 1970s at Y College in Herefordshire. And you start to see some more different flavours, some more aromatic flavours coming through: sage, citrus, spice, cedar, floral and pine, spicy, those hops. And then the hedgerow hybrids, again, from the 90s, these are from the 90s, again from Y College. So you can see that Britain was still very much at the forefront of hop development and breeding. Orange, marmalade, spicy, cedar, grapefruit and herbal. When you think of all the ways we describe wine flavours, here's the palette of hops for beer. And of course, this is just the hops. I've not spoken at all very much about the malts, which also obviously give a huge amount to the flavour. So that's where we're getting to. And then we go back to this event, the Boston Tea Party, which, trying to think when that actually happened, 1773. They threw the tea out, but they didn't throw the hops out, is the interesting lesson here. Because hops went over from Europe and Britain as America was colonised. And actually, hop production now is massive in the United States and really is at the forefront of modern hops and modern flavours of craft beers. And actually, here's an example of a diagram of the hop flower, and it's within the bracteole, which is the lighter green in the hop flower, that you get these lupulin glands, and in those are the resins and essential oils. Now, I actually do have a book on hops science, and actually the number of compounds is something like 400 and counting. So the complexity you can get from those hop glands is truly amazing. Probably up there with wines, but maybe Chris Evans or others can give us a bit of a comparison on that. So one of the biggest hop areas in the United States is the Yakima Valley. And actually, hops moved over, they're originally in the east, but as America translocated a lot of infrastructure and people over to the west, hops arrived there in the middle of the Victorian era, growing, and then first being distributed around the rest of the United States later in the 1800s. And from the 1940s, the hops started to come back around the rest of the world and started to be exported back round to the United Kingdom. And really, the Yakima Valley, you could really regard now in terms of hops as rather the Bordeaux or Burgundy of the hop world. And people, as they go to Bordeaux and Burgundy for holiday and to sample the wares, now go to the Yakima Valley. And there's a picture from the Victorian era of hop pickers. There in the Yakima area valley with massive hop vines behind them. And you can see a man with a beard standing in front of enormous piles of hop flowers. And people actually do, hop buyers from Britain go over to there to pick their hops every year to choose the ones that come back into craft beers. So I'll talk about a brewery in Birkenhead, and their brewers head over to Yakima to sample the wares. And really, the modern hop, the one at the bottom of that chart I showed you was Cascade, and this really is the signature hop of what called American Pale Ales. And what you've got in the Punk IPA is a English version of an American Pale Ale, and these are in essence, the craft beers of the modern era, moving on from the campaign for real ales. And this is the one par excellence that you would expect to see in these beers. Now we've moved from the Y college, and we start to see these development of and hybridization of hops in the United States. I'm really moving more towards a very fruity, citrus-like grapefruit in this particular hop. But these hops, the 3 Cs, Centennial and Columbus are 2 others, really starting to get those fruity notes out. And actually, they do really taste like these fruits. So the beer I suggested we might have a taste of this evening is Brewdog Punk IPA. And I put Sick for Galaxy because Galaxy is actually a variety of hop as well. Not actually in this beer, but this beer contains these hops, Chinook and Tarnum, and it also contains Simcoe and Nelson Sauvin, and that's actually from New Zealand, and you add in these hops at the end. So hops typically added when you're brewing in a beer to get the bitterness, you add them in very early, but all those essential oils boil off and those aromas and flavours disappear. Towards the end of the boil, as you're brewing your beer, you add in some more hops, that gives you the flavour. And then at the very end, when you what's called dry hop the beer, which is once it's finished boiling, you actually add the hops in at that point. That's called dry hopping, and that really boosts the hop oils and their flavours, those fruity flavours. So where you see that now, if you were to go into pretty much any supermarket now or off license, this is probably what you'll be faced with, which looks very different from Morrison's in the 1970s, I can tell you. And these, to a large extent, are these craft beers. So you can see here, the light blue one on the second, on the middle shelf, one in from the left, an American Pale Ale. That's what I've just been talking about. Punk IPA, we're talking about later. Neck Oil Session IPA. A lot of them are like that. And here's along the bottom row, Camden, which is a very famous craft brewery now in London. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these different beers now available to try. And in general, they are pretty excellent. Now, the one I showed you, Punk IPA, has got an enormous number of hops, but as in wine, here's a Grand Cru Classé from Bordeaux.
Yes.
Have you had that one, Chris?
Oh, yeah, I know where you are now.
Yeah. Now it's making sense.
It's on home territory.
Yeah. Now this is a blend of a number of grape varieties, and typically I think Chris can again come in later talking about the comparison between wine and beer. This would typically have 3 or maybe 4 different grape varieties in it, and Brewdog Punk IPA has got 4 or 5 varieties in it. But there's another movement which is obviously probably we can laud or blame the Australians for, is really single varietal wines, which now are very predominant, I think, in supermarkets. So a Cabernet Sauvignon as opposed to a more complex menu Bordeaux. And so it's the same with hops as well. So here is an example of what's called a smash beer. And what a smash stands for is single malt and single hop. So if you really do like a particular hop variety, as in if you liked a particular grape variety, you can now get single malt and hops of different sorts. So it does use a single malt, as opposed to a blend of malts, but you will only have a single hop. It may well be added in at those 3 points I've talked about as well. So I haven't really, I'm just going to briefly mention, sort of closing up now, the other constituents have a massive part to play as well. Really the focus has been, because hops are the preeminent constituent that people are thinking about and modifying in the 21st century. But barley, Britain has a very famous barley heritage up in the northeast particularly, and in Scotland, but also there is what's called the Icknield Way, which is an old ancient footpath that goes across really from East Anglia down towards Dorset. Is a chalk and limestone bed of rocks underneath the ground there, and that is brilliant for growing barley. And that is where some of the preeminent barleys of British history are grown. And probably the most famous British barley is one called Maris Otter. Anybody heard of Maris Piper? Hilary has. I always get her peeling them. They're potatoes. And Maris actually refers to Maris Lane in Cambridge, which was an agricultural development centre from the First World War, where all sorts of food varieties to improve productivity and food yield were developed. And Maris Piper potatoes were developed there, and Maris Otter barley was developed there as well. And so Maris is for Maris Lane, and Otter and Piper, as in sandpiper, they were always named after animals. So they are a little bit of history. And in fact, the Americans who really developed this new craft beer movement really favour great grains, barleys like Maris Otter, and they are favoured because they really help the profile. The other thing not to forget is actually the biggest constituent of beer is water. And historically, beers were defined by the water that was available in the ground underneath where the beer was brewed. So in Burton, the beer, very, very gypsum oriented, lots of calcium, magnesium and sulfate, very good for pale ales. In Pilsen, the beer is in essence, comes out of the ground like distilled water. It's got nothing else in it. Brilliant for Pilsner. So if you want to make a Pilsner at home, you would generally try and use distilled water. And Dublin, the water there, brilliant for making stouts. What tends to happen now with modern breweries is they actually take all the stuff out what the water board send to you. So here in the we get our water in West Kirby from the River Dee catchment, and that has a particular style. So the brewers here might well take all the solute back out by using reverse osmosis, and then add in the calcium, the magnesium, etc., according to whether they want a Burton, Pilsen, or Dublin beer. If you're making a malty beer, you generally use more chloride. If you're making a hoppy beer, you use more sulfate. And they do change the flavours and support the flavours. So brewers are thinking about all of these things as well as the hops. And you can add in extra things as well. So many of you will have had Hoegaarden beer at some point, or Hefeweizen, which is the German version of it. That has coriander and orange peel in it. And actually, those adjuncts, as they're called, are used to accentuate the fruitiness of the beers. And that's done, you'll see a lot of beers in there, if you go to the supermarket and specialist beer retailers, a lot of beers with those extra fruits in. So a modern take on that one I like, by Brewdog as well. They're a brewery up near Aberdeen. They put grapefruit juice in and they call it Elvis juice for reasons I don't understand. But actually the grapefruit flavours that come through in the hops are accentuated by the grapefruit. And it really is a nice thirst quenching pint. For those who don't like the bitter beers as much, I can highly recommend it. So what's, as well as the hops, other things have happened to make the craft beer revolution happen. Beer tax in the UK is reduced for small and craft breweries, so they can afford to trade. The giants of beer have to, get everything down to the ultimate in science to get their beers to be affordable so they can sell them cheap enough. The United States has driven a lot of this. I've talked about the hops and the innovation there, but the technology has helped as well. Software has helped brewers to adapt and develop recipes and get recipes. And social media is huge in sharing information. Carbon dioxide and pressure fermentation have also made a huge difference. It speeds things up and you produce these modern beers as well. So that's something you wouldn't have seen in the Burton Union system. And the culture has changed as well. It's about people and places. The Shoreditch hipster, we lived in East London for a few years, and the Shoreditch hipster sure like their craft beer and experimentation, the willingness to try amazing new things. And there is a Shoreditch hipster. And as you can see, he's got a tartan shirt on, a beard, so nothing has changed since the days of the campaign for Real Ale. He's looking a bit sad. So he's probably got fuggles in there. And this is an example of, and there are breweries like this scattered all over the country. This happens to be one in Birkenhead, right by the entrance to the Queensway Tunnel on the Birkenhead side, Glen Affric Brewery. They originally were planning to put a brewery actually in Glen Affric itself, but this got built first. And you can see all the huge number of beers they've brewed there. There's 9 on tap there, all in these sort of styles, particularly. And the ubiquitous tartan shirt as well. And that's a great place. I've been for a brewery. I've been to the Brewery Academy there for a day as well and learned a lot about modern brewing methods. But there are many of them, and then there's Love Lane Brewery in Liverpool, for example. So I do home brewing now, and it's one of my hobbies. I've taken up again after many years. On the left-hand side, this was how you used to brew beer. You used a plastic bucket and you put it in bottles. This now on the right is how you can brew beer rather like that brewery I've just showed you. That is a pressurized container. I can pump it through, full of CO2. As it ferments, I can see what's going on. And the red thing at the bottom, I can squirt CO2 gas in there. That means I can get hops in the bottom of that, flush them with carbon dioxide so there's no oxygen, because oxygen is the enemy of these sorts of beers, and I can produce a relatively passable beer. People say, that was a nice glass of beer, Steve, but they never asked for a second. So that's the story, really. So I thought it might be nice now to actually try a couple of these just to see what the difference is between them, if you're up for that. So what I can do is stop sharing the slides now and we can see each other. And I've got a can of Boddingtons, and I've got a can of Brewdog here as well. So has anybody else got something like that or equivalent?
I've got that.
Yeah. So if we try the should we try the Boddingtons first?
I couldn't find that for love nor money. I tried about 8 supermarkets.
You live in the south, don't you, David?
Yes.
Well, Tesco's Allerton Road had tons of it today.
All right.
I spent
must have
several
bought it all.
hours looking for it, but I managed to find that one.
Yeah. But as you can see, it says this can contains a pressurized widget. Be careful. So this can, if you open it, it will hiss. But this one will have CO2 and nitrogen in it, and when you pour it, it should form a relatively creamy head.
Where does the nitrogen come from?
It's pumped in at the time the can is filled.
Deliberately as a gas?
Yes, CO2, 70% nitrogen, 30% CO2.
Yeah, but nitrogen doesn't dissolve in water, Steve.
That's right, it makes bubbles. It's the same as when you go diving. So if you can you see how that's going down?
Yes.
That is typically what you see when you get draft Guinness, and that is typically what you see with a beer that has got a widget in and that has got nitrogen in. So the idea is it makes the beer look like a draft beer, like it's come out of a beer engine. So it has a head with small foam bubbles, and still see the small foam bubbles rising up because the nitrogen, as you say, David, isn't dissolving.
Can I ask,
and that is why the widget's there, really. As I say, I think it does take away slightly from the bitterness, but it doesn't really change the hoppiness particularly. If you smell it, you can smell the old men crying, sad captains, if you're familiar with the Elbow song. But not particularly, you're not getting tropical fruits or anything with that.
Can I ask, what is the point of a head on a beer?
It's fashion. In the north, in Yorkshire particularly, and in Germany with lagers, people like a head on the beer. But typically in the south, beers generally haven't had a big head on them. So in Yorkshire, when they have that beer engine, they're pulling the beer. The bottom of the tap that the beer comes out of has a device on it called a sparkler, and that sparkler froths the beer to create the head. Depending on the quality of the beer, the head may disappear in a few minutes, but typically it wants it to last longer.
Yeah, this beer's flat.
This one is.
Steve, is that the primary difference between draft and bottled beer, or are there other differences?
Generally the bottled beer is not live anymore for most of them. This isn't a live beer. Real ale in a pub, the beer is still got yeast in it.
Yeah.
And it's still alive, still fermenting, and that's producing the CO2 to keep the beer fizzy. And it does that, but the trouble is, once you expose it to oxygen, that starts to change the flavours, and in particular, that will interfere with the hop flavours, fruitiness, and start to dissipate them. So really, you open a cask, you've got to drink it reasonably quickly.
Yeah.
A few days at the most. Keep it cool, obviously, because and that's why some pubs, they'll tell you how long a cask has been on, so you know how fresh it has been. the casks, it's CO2 pressurized and kept cool, so no oxygen can get in. So they can keep that for weeks and weeks if they want to, if not longer.
Yeah. Steve?
Very helpful.
Andrew?
Steve, hi. You said that mild beers were becoming much less common. What's the reason for that? And I see an awful lot of gold beers when I go up to the Lake District. Has that taken over from the mild beers?
Well, maybe it has in volume terms. Mild just seems to be fashion. It's, you know, beer is sold by publicity, isn't it? And Boddington's the cream of Manchester, you know, mild drunk by sad old men. Because it did have that reputation as a rather lower class beer. It was often not a premium beer. Whereas if you had, this is bitter, but you can get best bitter and extra special bitter. The idea being they're more premium beers and more worthwhile. And, you know, mild will be drunk in working persons clubs. But, you know, they are nice beers, and they are although they're darker, they're not stronger. Right. They have you know, the malt has a little bit of dark malt in it to give them that dark flavour. But they're meant to be session beers, or you can drink a few of them.
So what defines gold?
Gold is just the colour. And in general, they're in a move to move a bitter beer to more like a lager. So it's lighter, more golden, and they'll vary the hops a bit. They'll often have those newer English hops in them, like Challenger and what have you, as opposed to the older Fuggle hops. And often you see them really pushed out in the summer as a thirst-quenching beer, you know, alongside the lagers. So I think it's that sort of area of the market that those golden beers are after.
What's unique about brown? The brown. I go with a friend of mine. He wants the brown. I don't know what it is.
Yeah. Well, a brown ale is Newcastle Brown. So there is actually all beer styles there's something called the Beer Judge Certification Program, which all recognised beer styles are set out. And if you want to brew in a competition as a home brewer, you have to get to that style, and brown beers are a particular style. They're not very fashionable at the moment, interestingly.
When I was a child, I think one of the very first beers that my dad gave me was a thing called Man's Brown Ale.
Oh yes, from the Midlands, yeah.
Yeah. I never see it now.
No, I've not seen that for ages. But, you know, the stouts and the porters have really taken over in terms of the dark beers now. They're the fashion.
There's no doubt that the widget transformed Guinness from being a bottle of beer into something which is really quite acceptable and more like the draft Guinness. So you could have a can of Guinness in Japan or wherever, but when it tasted like draft Guinness. And I think it really did it. I was fascinated by the widget. I thought there must be a battery in this. Why would it come flying up through the top? And whether I should be making batteries for the widget, you know. There we are. But it does, and it changes the taste of bodies as well, from a bottled beer to the creamy scene. And of course, it's the Irish that have got the imagery of looking at the Guinness just flattening out, and you think,
Steve, if you go
a horrible feeling
borders,
that was thought up by a London PR company. But I was just wondering, Steve, whether or not alcohol content was important. One reason why mild used to be popular was that it was lower alcohol and cheaper.
Yeah.
I mean, is alcohol? How much does the strength of the beer play into this situation?
Well, I think generally the craft beers are a lot of them are aiming at the 5 to 6% market. I think the Brewdog's around that.
Brewdog is 5.4.
Yeah, and they're pitching around there. And the American market is they don't the Americans, as a general, don't drink a huge lot of alcohol, do they? It's
No.
except for those that do.
I discovered when I was a fellow in Canada, they used to have these things in my lab called beer seminars, where people would go along in the evening and present their research over a variety of beers, which were kept on ice in the middle of the room.
All right.
And I came along from a sort of British tradition of 3.5% craft beers, and I would have a couple of cans, which were about 6%, I discovered, which was standard there, and then wondered what had happened. And I think that this difference comes back to just the Americans like the beer stronger than we do.
Yeah, they don't tend to drink pints. If you have a look, the BrewDog is generally served in those cans, which is what, is it 330 or 400 mils? 330 mils. So they don't tend to come in pints. This is the typical size of a craft ale. The other thing, just the point that Max was making, you know, the chain of getting the beer right so it can travel to Nigeria, which is, Guinness is the most popular beer in Nigeria, for example. And thinking of vaccines, is the cold chain. The real top-end craft brewers, they've put hop oils in here at great difficulty. They want it to get to you perfectly, and they insist that their beer goes by cold chain. It's transported and kept in a refrigerator. And if you go to the top, you won't see this in Morrison's, but if you go to the top craft ale places, they will have a fridge, and that's reserved for these people who really want you to get the absolute essence of what they've crafted.
I have a sneaky feeling it won't be at -70 there.
No, it's hard to drink. But it's interesting in terms of alcohol percentage. At the brewery I showed you, Glen Affric, they do this modern stuff, and then they tip it into barrels, old Scotch, bourbon, and wine barrels, and they ferment it for months and months and months. And they brew it very strong. I've got some for my son for Christmas. They are 15%.
Oh, God.
And they're stouts and porters that have been barrel aged in bourbon casks. They are very, very different. And certainly, Peter, if you'd had two pints of them, you wouldn't be here tonight. I suspect.
It's like the sort of very strong Belgian beers, but honestly, that's powerful. That's really powerful.
And those, you'd have one can, you'd probably share it between two of you.
Yeah.
Rather like port or something like that. They are sipping. You couldn't knock one of those back. It would be unpalatable to do so.
As a student in Sheffield, there was a pub that brewed the strongest beer in the world, they claimed. It was about 20-odd%.
Yeah.
And you bought it in a third of a pint.
Right.
And if you have 3 of them, you got a certificate.
Oh, God.
Well, it's interesting you should say that.
And a liver transplant.
Sorry?
And a liver transplant.
Yes, definitely.
But BrewDog brew a beer called Tactical Nuclear Penguin. So remember that for the quiz. And Tactical Nuclear Penguin is 35% alcohol.
Oh, how much? Sorry, Steve.
35%.
Yeah, and they brew it by making a very strong beer, and then they freeze
freeze
it,
fractionate.
and refreeze it a few times, and they get it to 35%.
Like ice wine.
Yes.
That's horrendous.
Yes, exactly.
How do they call it beer? It's not a beer. That's that.
It's more like gin.
Barley
Well,
wine.
it starts with hops, malts, and water, and
Still beer.
Steve, Sid McNulty knows I drink lager all the time. He tried to convert me to beer, and he gave me some Innocent Gun stuff,
oh yeah,
which was absolutely amazing.
Right.
Obviously, it's 6-7% alcohol.
Right.
But if ever I do convert to beer, it'll be because of Innocent Gun.
All right. And
Well, I
then,
remember being finished off at a beer festival with some stuff called Orkney's Skull Splitter.
oh
And that
yes,
just completely knocked me for six.
I saw you, Peter, coming out of the toilets.
That's right. I was in and out like a yo-yo.
So the other one is the brew dog.
Yes, let's try that now.
And if you just open it and just sniff it, you'll immediately sniff the fruit notes there.
Yeah.
Especially if you after you've just poured it, particularly, and it's frothing up. And what you should see is that the bubbles should behave differently because this is just CO2. So a lot more bubbles on top, but you don't get that creamy stuff happening underneath.
Steve, hi, it's Ray. Can I just come in?
Sure, Ray.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, is it still primarily a male phenomenon, beer? Because if I was a beer marketing man, I'd get Beyonce and a few kind of female influencers to drink beer. And I don't know whether the young women have taken it up yet. And I put a little reminiscence in the chat about when Colm and I were students back in the 70s, and we used to drink in Hartigan's, a pub near the medical school. And believe it or not, the custom in the 70s in Dublin was that most of the bars wouldn't serve pints to women, because drinking a pint, if you're a bit unladylike and, you know, slurping a great big pint, they'd only serve them half pints. And this was the cause of enormous controversy, because the early feminists kind of, you know, took umbrage at this. And there was a sort of a protest group in Hartigan's, because Alf in Hartigan's, he would serve pints. So the women would flock into Hartigan's and buy pints of Guinness and drink them as a kind of a feminist protest, you know. But I know it's hard to believe that, but they really and truly would not serve pints to women in Dublin in the 70s. It was
That was very true when I was a student in Scotland as well. They wouldn't serve the girls.
Say again, Peter?
I said in Scotland when I was a student up there, they basically wouldn't allow the girls to have a big pint glass. They had to have a half glass.
And a fancy shape. A fancy shape.
Yeah, and of course, the other thing is that
they've come back a bit.
The price of a half pint, Steve, was a little more than half the price of a pint, if you know what I mean.
Right.
So, of course, the landlords were ripping off the women, because, you know, you might get whatever, £1.20 for 2 glasses and £1 for a pint.
I think.
Okay, fellas, I'm going to have to go. I'm off for a 5-mile run now, so I'll.
Listen, before you go, it's good to make contact. How are you?
Oh, getting by.
Great.
Survived Barbados, you know.
I was just saying that the cancellation of your retirement saved me having to do a speech, but maybe next year.
Okay. See you soon. Keep well. Keep safe.
Bye.
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 So just to say, if you taste this one, it does taste very different, and you can smell the aroma of the fruit, and you can taste the fruits in there.
This fascinates me, Steve, because I'm as you know, an organic chemist, and I just wonder whether the volatiles that you're talking about for citrus and vanilla and all these other things are actually the same volatiles that we find in wines. I suspect they are, but I just don't know.
Well, I tell you what, if you there's this book here, The New IPA, A Scientific Guide.
Oh,
Christmas present for David.
Yeah.
Christmas presents all around, I suspect.
Yeah.
Can you?
I got this from Amazon. So, and the author is see there, Scott Janish.
Can you email me the ISBN?
Yeah, we'll do. And that's got all the chemical stuff.
That's what I'm interested in. That's what I'm interested in, because my training is in organic chemistry, and that's what I did.
I'm sure Santa will put one under in your stocking, David.
Yes, I think you deserve one, David. After all that, definitely.
The book doesn't come with an aroma.
Is there a budget? We'll put it in the library.
Yes, get a copy for the library, definitely.
What library?
While we're talking about
another time.
You know, while we're talking about volatiles, and we've got different glass shapes here, haven't we? So, you know, people who are in the 20 Club, we've had this ongoing debate about which glass is best for us and stuff. I don't know what's going on with beer and glasses. It's just a random glass that you get depending on where you go. Anybody got any preferences for glasses, or how would you pick what glass goes with what beer?
A Brewdog goes in one like this because this is a Brewdog glass. Whether they condone it, I don't know.
Glass.
They vary, and I haven't got one with me, but there is a particular style of glass that's meant to be for stouts, which is it's a bit convoluted at the bottom, a narrowish stem, and then base, and then it flutes out. And so, I mean, whether it's science or merchandising, it varies. But if you get Belgian beers, which are, they all have their own glass, don't they? Hogarth,
yes.
And
but again, beer is filled very high in the glass.
Yeah.
Whereas wine, you leave a lot of empty glass to get the ideal experience.
Some of the Belgian beers are like that you might not fill the glass up entirely. They are more like a wine glass in shape.
Yeah. Well, if you go to places like Munster for the beer festival, you'll be given a thing. It's called a Stein.
Yeah.
S-T-I-N. And you will go to the bar and you say Einstein bitter. And it's a bloody great big thing about it's a liter.
Yeah.
And it's just like it's like a flower vase, basically.
Yeah. Interestingly, I've got a keg of Oktoberfest.
Have you?
In the cellar at the moment, yes. So, which interestingly is a slightly darker beer than you would think. It's not a standard fizzy lager. It's a bit different.
Steve. Einstein is very nice on a hot day.
Steve, what do you call your home brew? Have you a name for it?
No, I haven't started naming them yet, but I'm thinking of I should do.
Yeah. Steve,
lay them down.
You showed a slide, a very nice slide of the USA with the Yakima Valley.
Yeah.
Now the point of the star looked like it was very close to a very good wine producing area called Mary Hill. And if you go west at that particular point, you end up going from sort of temperate English type of countryside into desert fairly quickly.
All right.
An hour's drive takes you into desert. So is the beer producing area near the wine producing area, and what makes it so good?
I don't know how near it is, but it basically has I think the Cascade Mountains on one side of it.
Yeah.
And which is where the name for Cascade hops comes from. And apparently it is quite dry, so they use water, a big system of canals to get the water and irrigation off the Cascades.
Yeah,
the rain and the melting ice to get the water down onto the plain. So it sounds like it is quite arid if it was left to its own devices.
Yeah.
The wine they produce there, they sell it all. It doesn't get. It's fantastic wine, but you actually have to go to the vineyard to buy it. They don't actually sell it.
They don't export it at all.
They don't export it at all, and it's beautiful wine.
Just amazing. The demand is so much that they don't send it anywhere.
I've been trying to get Hilary, who's in the room here, to think about coming to the Yakima Valley. Now there's wine on offer.
Oh, the wine is fantastic.
Yeah.
There are loads of vineyards all along the Columbia River, about an hour inland from Portland.
Oh, wow.
As far as your eye can see. Very nice.
Right. Has everybody had a taste of agree there's a difference between how they pour the bubbles and the flavours as well?
Yeah.
Totally different.
Yes.
Different.
How's your tasting buds doing, Andrew? Are you getting in the zone?
Well, my taste is okay. It's Sharon that didn't recover the taste.
Right.
But I have the Bluebird.
Oh, right.
And some more Lake District ones. So we'll get your beers tomorrow when we go out.
My fault. I didn't open my email from my husband.
It's communication between
communication.
Yeah.
Well, My taste buds are not good. But it's interesting because we've had 4 different beers tonight, and one of them I couldn't taste at all.
Really?
Really?
Taste at all from it. It was like water.
COVID.
That was
Long COVID. What's that one?
It's that one. There was no, for me, there was
Head
no
Point.
taste at all. But the Coniston and the, what was the other one?
Cumberland.
No, didn't like the Cumberland. What was the other one? Altitude.
Altitude.
That's really nice.
I mean, there's beers for everybody. If you try enough, you will find a few, won't you, that will suit you.
If you want to ever go and get good beer or wide range, go to Booth's Supermarket.
All right.
One in Ormskirk and the one in Windermere is just amazing.
All right. Very good.
Yeah. There's a Booths in Ripon where we go to quite a lot, and I've noticed they've got quite a lot of beers, but I prefer the Yorkshire ones anyway. So there we are. We have the Black Sheep, and we have Theakston's, and we have ones in Thirsk, and they're all jolly good beers.
I'm about to do a Theakston's Best Bitters, my next one.
Oh, good.
Because that I think is a cracking bitter. So
Party at your house.
Sorry.
Party at your house.
Yeah. Well, I've got sufficient supplies and nobody to share it with. So.
Oh, we'll all turn up one day. Watch out.
Plenty of people come, but nobody has a second glass. So. Colm, you had a few questions there. Is there anything?
Where's he gone?
He's on mute.
Where does Smittix fit into all this?
Is that the Irish one?
That's the Irish bitter. It's the only one.
Is it? Is it any good?
If the Guinness is off and there's no lager, well then that's what you have to drink.
I think you've said it, haven't you? But a lot of, the brewery Guinness is, lots of those breweries now are trying to, mega breweries are trying to get in on the act. So they have their Hop House 13 or something like that, lager.
Oh, that's fantastic. I have a shed load of that in the fridge. I think it's a wonderful lager. Hop House 13. Excellent.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I think it tastes better in the tin than in the bottle.
All right.
The other thing was that, Steve, I put a question up on chat. Do pubs have to throw away all their beer now? Or if a keg is unopened, can they keep it for a month or two?
If it's a keg, they can keep it for months and months and months. Keep it refrigerated. If there's oxygen not got into it, it will last a long, long time. So if you're a publican, why would unless you've got a big turnover of keg ales.
Yeah, but there were
craft ales would be a disaster then currently.
As you can, some craft ales do come as real ales in kegs. But they are short, but they won't be coming from America. They'll be, the local brewery. So there's Brimstage Brewery in Brimstage on the Wirral, tiny little next to the pig farm.
Good grief.
Beer doesn't taste of pigs. They produce real ales to go on tap, but you would regard them as a craft brewery.
I've seen pictures on the BBC News of brewery owners.
Yeah, typically.
They're small breweries, admittedly, and they're crying their eyes out because they've been forced to turn down the drain thousands of litres of beer because of COVID.
If it's real ale, you probably have got to get rid of it. The brewery I've talked about, Glen Affric, they've gone for canning big style because they're selling, to all over the place really, and they've moved very much to trying to do that. In fact, we went and got these beers for my son for Christmas the other day, and we went there to the brewery and got them from the brewery door, and they're clearly moving to that, to try and keep the business going basically. But they're a big craft brewery, whereas Brimstage is tiny little place, so you do feel.
Just out of interest, this is what I think the best lager going at the moment. Hop House 13 in a tin. It's got an extraordinary flavour that I don't get in any other lagers, and I've nothing to do with Guinness in Ireland.
It's probably got noble hops in it then, hasn't it? So I would imagine.
Well, it tastes very different to any other lager I've ever had.
All right. I'll have to. I've never tried that. I'll have to give it a go, basically. So
Morrison's doing a good deal on it.
I shall go and have a look. Steve, one thing that's very interesting is there are a lot of craft ales brewed in Italy. When you go there, they're nice to try. But the government in Italy has put a massive tax on them all to try and protect the wine industry. And so if you go for a beer in a bar there, and it's one of the craft beers, it can really fleece you. It's so expensive.
Well, they're not. You know, the ones I talked about that have been done in a barrel, and they're 13%. They're £8 a can. So Christmas present only for those ones, I have to say. So
there are also some very nice brews in Brittany, which I imagine is very much the influence of the Celtic fringe in Britain, of course.
Well, the big
There's some very good beers there.
Big cider country, Brittany, as well, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah, somebody mentioned about, is it a man's drink or a woman's drink? Again, the Glenafric Brewery, they're getting into something called hard soda, which is basically fruit-based drinks with alcohol in them. They're basically going to be the adult version of Alco Pops, basically, which were really targeted at youth. But they're looking to do that, so they have them. And there's one called Hard Seltzer as well, which is a fizzy one that is, based on beer brewing, but with those flavours in. So they were experimenting with that. The other thing which I'm not too keen on with them, though it is legal, is CBD beers, cannabis.
Oh, you're joking.
Cannabis oil, not the marijuana content. Well, because marijuana comes in two components, the psychogenic and
tetrahydrocannabinol.
Yeah, not the THBC, but the CBD.
This is the one you buy in Holland Barrett.
Yeah, which is no earthly effect on anybody, I don't think, but nonetheless
has no physiological effect.
Yeah, stoners like the thought of having beer with it in, so they're doing that. We often meet them on our walks to Heswall, actually, behind a hedge. I think we've probably done, are we? And
we are done, Steve. That was very, very interesting, and thank you very much for doing it.
Before you go, let me show you what I've just pulled out of my cellar.
That's very similar to something we've seen before, isn't it?
Yes. Notice the year, though, please.
Oh my goodness,
what's it, 18 something or other?
2008.
Yeah.
That is the very best vintage available currently, and I'm going to drink it probably at Christmas.
Oh, very good.
Lucky you.
I would never dare do a talk on wine if you were in the audience.
Why not?
I think you should.
What I must do is thank Karen, actually, because she's
well done, Karen.
set us up and got it all working perfectly well this evening. I've been joining her own tipple, but which isn't beer. But maybe we've converted you, Karen.
Oh, I don't know.
Thanks, Karen. It's been fantastic. It really has.
Good. Okay.
Yes, it was
See you all.
fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for all
Thanks,
that.
Gav. Nice to see you there.
Say goodbye then.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye everybody.
Bye.
Steve, thank you. Bye.